In the middle of the night, my husband and I rushed our daughter to the hospital. Just then, an ambulance screamed up to the entrance. On the gurney were my sister-in-law and my brother-in-law, stuck together in a compromising and critical state. My husband and I froze, utterly stunned. That afternoon, my husband Mark and I had taken our daughter, Lily, for her scheduled vaccinations at the pediatrician's office. She was just over 3, and from the moment we walked into the exam room, she clung to my neck, her little mouth trembling on the verge of tears. I soothed her with promises of a cupcake afterward, while Mark stood by, smiling and stroking her hair. Everything was perfectly normal. The nurse, a kind woman named Carol, warned us that Lily might run a low-grade fever that night. Just keep an eye on her temperature and give her a lukewarm bath if she feels warm, she'd advised. I thought nothing of it, assuming it would be like all the other times, a slight fever, and then she'd be fine by morning. I never imagined that night would become the most horrific of my life. Back home, I made chicken and rice soup for Lily. She was still in good spirits, chattering about her day at preschool as she ate. Mark sat beside her, scrolling through his phone while spoon-feeding her the last few bites. The peace in our home was so complete that I couldn't have conceived that in just a few hours, both our families would be shattered. Around 9 p.m., Lily started to feel warm. I checked her temperature, 100.1 degrees Fahrenheit. "It's fine, Lauren," Mark said. "Just a reaction to the shots." But I'm a worrier by nature, so I kept feeling her forehead, dabbing her with a cool cloth, and making her drink water. Near midnight, I was dozing off when I heard her whisper, "Mommy, hot." I shot up. The moment I touched her forehead, I recoiled. Lily was burning up like a piece of coal. Her lips were dry, and her cheeks were flushed a deep red. My hands shaking, I took her temperature again. 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Mark, wake up." I practically screamed. My husband bolted upright. The second he saw our daughter, his face went pale. Lily was becoming delirious, her eyes shut tight as she mumbled, "Mommy," over and over. Mark didn't waste a second. He flipped on the lights, threw on some clothes, and turned to me. "No waiting. We're going to the hospital. Now." I held Lily, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fears of a severe vaccine reaction. Mark ran downstairs to get the car while I wrapped Lily in a blanket and hurried after him. The cold of the 1 a.m. air hit us. The streets were deserted, and the wind was biting, but a cold sweat was already soaking through my shirt. Lily felt like a furnace in my arms, her breathing shallow and weak. I wanted to cry. Mark kept glancing back from the driver's seat. "Is she still conscious, Lauren?" "Her fever is too high, Mark," I choked out. At the hospital, Mark rushed to handle the intake forms while I sat with Lily in the pediatric emergency area. The harsh fluorescent lights made everyone look gaunt and tired. The sound of a crying baby, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the urgent calls of doctors, it was a symphony of anxiety that only made me more frantic. I clutched Lily, my eyes glued to the digital thermometer taped to her tiny hand. Just as a doctor was about to examine her, the piercing wail of an ambulance siren echoed from outside. The sound of tires screeching to a halt in the dead of night made everyone in the ER turn their heads. An ambulance had pulled up at a reckless speed. The back doors flew open, and paramedics hastily wheeled out a gurney. On it were 2 people, covered to their necks with a single blanket. At first, I assumed it was a car accident or a stroke and didn't pay much attention. But then a corner of the blanket slipped. I glanced over, and my entire body went rigid. The man on the gurney, his face ashen and his hair a mess, was Kevin, my older sister's husband. My brother-in-law. Before I could process it, the face of the woman beside him was also revealed. Her hair was in disarray, her makeup smeared, her lips pale with panic. It was Megan, my husband's sister-in-law, his brother's wife. They were under the same blanket, their lower bodies intimately entangled in a position that left no doubt as to what had just happened. The paramedics exchanged awkward glances. A male doctor frowned and muttered, "Cover them up, quickly." A nurse standing near me whispered, "Another heart attack in the saddle." I turned to my husband, my voice trembling so badly I could barely form words. "Mark, look. Is that Kevin and Megan?" Mark had just returned with a stack of paperwork. He followed my gaze and froze. The papers slipped from his hand, scattering across the cold, white linoleum floor. I clutched Lily tighter, a chilling dread creeping up my spine, as if I had just fallen into a bottomless pit. I stood there, paralyzed in the hospital corridor, one hand holding my feverish daughter, the other unconsciously gripping Mark's sleeve. Mere feet away, my daughter was being monitored for a high fever. And on the other side of a thin curtain in the trauma bay, my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law were being treated for a humiliation so profound, no one dared speak its name. Life has these bizarre, cruel moments. In the same instant, you can be terrified of losing your child while witnessing the sordid secret of your relatives laid bare before your very eyes. I wanted to storm over there, to rip back that curtain and demand to know what was going on. Why was Kevin there with Megan? Why were these two people, who had no reason to be together in the middle of the night, on the same ambulance gurney in that condition? But Lily was on the examination bed, her small face flushed, her lips chapped. A single soft moan from her was enough to push every other question from my mind. I am a mother. My first duty was to my child. Mark stood beside me, his face so pale he looked like he'd been drained of blood. He stared at the curtain, then back at Lily, his jaw clenched tight. It took him a few seconds to bend down and pick up the fallen paperwork, his hand visibly shaking. He grabbed my wrist, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Stay calm, Lauren. Focus on Lily. We'll deal with that later." His words only made my heart ache more. I knew he was no calmer than I was. The woman behind that curtain was Megan, the wife of his own brother, David. The man was Kevin, the husband of my own sister, Sarah. At a family dinner, those two were supposed to maintain a respectful distance. But tonight, they were brought to a hospital in a situation that would make a stranger blush. The curtain was quickly drawn shut. Inside, we could hear the urgent commands of doctors, the clatter of instruments on a metal tray, and the hurried footsteps of nurses, all mixed with the muffled sobs of a woman. I recognized Megan's voice. She was crying, stammering, "Don't call anyone. Please, doctor, don't call anyone. Please, don't call my husband." That plea sent a shiver down my spine. Megan's husband was David, Mark's younger brother. A man so gentle that he would often just smile and let it go when his wife raised her voice at him. Since their wedding day, David had trusted Megan completely, adored her, and handed over his entire paycheck to her. I remember him telling Mark at a family dinner once, "I'm not as successful as you, bro, but I promise I'll never let my wife feel neglected." Thinking of those words now, my throat felt tight. Kevin was different. He lay inside, his breathing heavy, groaning in pain. That man, who was always impeccably dressed and spoke with such gravitas, who always played the part of the model husband at my parents' house. He often lectured me that trust was the most important thing in a marriage. Yet here was the man who preached morality, now unable to look anyone in the eye. A nurse stepped out and asked quietly, "Is there any family here for these two patients?" From inside, Megan's voice rose in panic. "You don't need to call anyone. I can sign whatever you need. Just don't call my husband." Her voice was distorted with fear, stripped of its usual sweet, artful tone. I looked at Mark and saw the fury in his eyes. He leaned close to my ear and ground out, "If I hadn't seen this with my own eyes, I would never have believed it." I didn't answer, because I felt the same way. I had shared meals with them. I had seen Kevin play with my daughter. I had heard Megan call me sis, in that sugary voice of hers. I had always thought that while every family had its issues, at least relatives knew how to respect boundaries. I never imagined they had stomped those boundaries to dust long ago. Just as my mind was a tangled mess, the pediatrician called me over. I quickly let go of Mark's arm and rushed to Lily's bedside. The doctor, after reviewing the tests, said her fever was high but there were no immediate signs of danger. They would work on bringing the fever down and monitor her for a few more hours. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, tears of relief welling in my eyes. At least my daughter was okay. At least in this horrifying night, I had one thing to hold on to. But when I turned and saw Mark standing in the hallway, I knew the real storm was just beginning. He was on his phone, trying to call David, but it went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. My hand trembled as I called my sister, Sarah. Her phone just rang and rang until it fell silent. The fact that no one was answering filled me with a deeper dread. Mark leaned against the wall, his eyes fixed on the emergency room curtain. I held Lily, whose fever had started to subside, but my heart was still pounding like a drum. That night, I thought I was taking my daughter to the hospital for a post-vaccination fever. But it turned out that fever had dragged my husband and me to the right place at the right time to witness the masks being torn from the faces of our closest relatives. And I knew, from the moment Mark couldn't reach David and Sarah, that this night was no longer a private matter. It was about to tear us all apart. As the doctor instructed me to move Lily to an observation room, I couldn't stop thinking about Megan's ashen face behind that curtain. She had been crying, begging the doctor not to call her husband. Her trembling voice was a world away from the sweet tones I had heard for years at family gatherings. Looking at her then, I suddenly remembered the day she first joined the family, the day I genuinely thought I had gained a sister. Megan married into the family 2 years after I did. When she was first introduced, everyone praised her for being pretty, quick-witted, and a smooth talker. She wasn't overtly glamorous, but she had a way of making people feel at ease. In front of my mother-in-law, Sharon, she was always demure and helpful. "Let me do the dishes, Mom. Lauren needs to take care of Lily." A simple sentence like that was enough to win Sharon over. At first, I sincerely liked Megan. I thought, as the only 2 daughters-in-law, we could understand each other, especially in a family where the men could be oblivious and the elders scrutinized every word. I imagined that on holidays, I wouldn't be stuck in the kitchen alone anymore. That if I had issues with my mother-in-law, I'd have someone to talk to. But living with her, I began to see that Megan's kindness was strange. In front of our elders, she always played the martyr, her words soft and accommodating, making her seem like the perfect, respectful sister-in-law. But behind their backs, she would drop comments that seemed innocent but left a bitter aftertaste. Once, while I was trying to cook with Lily on my hip, Megan stood by and said with a laugh, "You're amazing, Lauren, handling a baby and the kitchen. If I had a kid, I don't think I could let myself struggle like that." Then she'd cover her mouth and giggle as if it were just a joke. She complained about David constantly. He was Mark's younger brother, a technician whose salary wasn't high but who was incredibly hardworking. He gave his entire paycheck to Megan and would come home from work to help with chores and fix things around the house. Yet, in front of Sharon, Megan would often sigh, "I don't need to be rich, Mom." But when a man is too nice, with no ambition, it's hard on his wife and kids. Instead of scolding Megan, Sharon would often take her side. She'd say to David, "Look at your wife. She's young and beautiful. She made a sacrifice marrying you. You'd better step up, or you'll lose her." David would just lower his head with a forced smile, while Megan sat there, looking down at her plate as if deeply wounded. But I noticed, more than once, a flicker of a smirk on her lips, so quick you'd miss it if you weren't looking. I felt for David. He was my brother-in-law. But he was a kind, decent man who never disrespected his older brother or me. Whenever he came over, he'd bring a carton of juice or a bag of cookies for Lily and spend an hour on the floor, assembling toys for her. But in Megan's eyes, all that goodness meant nothing compared to money and a polished image. She wanted a husband who took her to fancy restaurants, bought her designer bags, and spoke with worldly confidence, not a man who came home smelling of machine oil. It was around then that I started noticing the way Megan looked at Kevin. Kevin was my sister Sarah's husband, so to me, he was my brother-in-law. Whenever Sarah brought him to our house or we met at family dinners, Megan's demeanor would change. She'd become exceptionally bright and attentive. Her voice would turn syrupy sweet. "Have some more iced tea, Kevin." "Wow, Kevin, you have great taste in wine. You sound so confident when you talk, Kevin." At first, I dismissed it as politeness. But her enthusiasm soon became excessive. Once, during a hot pot dinner, Kevin casually mentioned the dipping sauce was a bit bland. Megan immediately stood up to make him a new one. David, sitting right next to her, had the same bland sauce, but she didn't even glance his way. Kevin laughed. "You're a real catch, Megan. David's a lucky man." Megan blushed slightly. "Oh, I don't know about that. You're just being nice, Kevin." Hearing that, I saw David freeze for a moment, his chopsticks hovering in midair. Sharon only made things worse. She would praise Megan in front of relatives. "Our Megan is smart. She knows how to talk, how to carry herself. She never embarrasses our family." Then she'd turn to David and say, half joking, "When your wife is smarter than you, you'd better know how to keep her. Got it?" Once, she even said cryptically, "A smart woman knows where to find her support." Marrying a poor man means a life of counting pennies at the grocery store. It made me uncomfortable, but I told myself it was just an older person's way of talking, with no deeper meaning. Megan also started finding excuses to ask Kevin for help. Her phone was acting up, she had questions about car financing, or she wanted advice on a small business loan to open a beauty salon. These were things David could have helped with, or Mark could have advised on. But she always went to Kevin. And Kevin was always willing, showing an almost inappropriate level of concern. "Just send it to me, Megan. A woman shouldn't have to stress about money matters." My sister, Sarah, trusted her husband almost completely. When she saw how helpful Kevin was to my in-laws, she praised him for being so thoughtful and considerate. I heard this and didn't know what to say. Without proof, I couldn't plant a seed of doubt in my own sister's mind. There was only one time, when I was passing the balcony, that I saw Megan talking to Kevin. She was looking up at him. Her gaze soft and yielding, not the look a woman gives her sister-in-law's husband. Kevin was leaning down, saying something quietly. Megan laughed, then quickly turned away when she saw me. A deeply unsettling feeling washed over me, but I immediately chided myself for it. I was afraid of thinking the worst of people, of letting a few glances and a couple of misplaced words unravel our families. I told myself I was being too sensitive, that Megan just liked attention and Kevin was naturally flirtatious. It wasn't until that night at the hospital, seeing them together on that gurney, that I understood a woman's intuition is rarely without cause. But to only talk about Megan would be incomplete. Because in this story, the person who horrified me most after that night wasn't just the drama-loving sister-in-law. It was the man lying next to her on that gurney who truly chilled me to the bone. Kevin was my sister Sarah's husband, so I called him my brother-in-law. For years, he had presented himself to everyone as a successful, poised, well-spoken, and responsible man. He wasn't loud or boisterous. He was always impeccably dressed, crisp dress shirt, polished watch, neatly combed hair. Every time he came to my parents' house for dinner, he would carry the gifts into the kitchen himself, greet my parents respectfully, and then turn to me. "How are things, Lauren? Is Mark helping you with Lily?" On the surface, anyone would think he was the most thoughtful man alive. I used to think so, too. During family dinners, Kevin loved to talk about morality. He would speak about marriage, about fidelity, about a man's duty to his wife and children. Once, Sarah joked that it was hard to trust men these days. Kevin put down his chopsticks, smiled calmly, and said, "A married man has to know his boundaries. You can be friendly out in the world, but the line of your family is something you never cross." His words earned nods of approval from everyone at the table. My father even praised Sarah for her good fortune in marrying such a thoughtful man. Looking back on it now, it's so bitterly ironic it makes me sick. The man who spoke most eloquently about boundaries was the first to trample all over them. The one who lectured others on how to be a good husband was the one brought to a hospital in the most humiliating state, with my husband's brother's wife. Kevin particularly enjoyed showing off his worldliness in front of David, Megan's husband. Because David was quiet, earned less, and was less talkative, he was often the subject of comparison by our mother-in-law, Sharon. Whenever Sharon criticized David's lack of ambition, Kevin would clap him on the shoulder like an experienced older brother. "A man has to have ambition, David. It's okay to be a little poor, but if you disappoint your wife, a woman's heart can easily stray." At the time, I just found the comment tasteless. I thought he was being tactless, saying something so personal in front of David and Megan. But I never thought deeper, that Kevin was deliberately putting David down to elevate himself. The way he said it wasn't advice, it was a subtle message for Megan to hear. David wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't enough of a man to lean on. Kevin had a very polished brand of chivalry. He opened car doors for women, refilled glasses when he saw they were empty, pulled out chairs, offered a tissue at the right moment, and made just enough small talk to make people feel seen. Sarah once told me, "Kevin's like that with everyone. He's just been considerate since he was young." I believed her, because she was my sister, and I didn't want to harbor ugly suspicions about her husband. But I later realized Kevin's thoughtfulness wasn't selfless. It was selective. With my mother, he was respectful. With Sarah, he played his part. With me, he maintained a proper distance. But with Megan, his attention always lingered a little too long, an extra glance, an extra question, a slightly deeper bow. A smile that looked polite on the surface, but felt unclean if you watched it for too long. Once, we all went out to a restaurant for Lily's birthday. It was crowded, and everyone found their own seats. I was busy with Lily and didn't notice until I looked up and saw Kevin sitting next to Megan. David was across from his wife, and Sarah was next to me. Kevin handed Megan a glass of water and joked, "David, you'd better keep a close eye on your wife. A woman this beautiful is a danger out in the world." The whole table laughed, thinking it was a harmless joke. But I couldn't laugh. I saw Megan blush and look down, saying, "Oh, Kevin, you're just teasing me." But her lips curved into that quick, pleased smirk again. David just gave a strained laugh, the laugh of a man whose pride had been stung but who didn't know how to react. Mark, sitting next to me, glanced over, his expression darkening for a second. When we got home, all he said was, "Kevin's jokes go a little too far." I stayed silent, because I agreed. After that, I noticed Kevin started using the excuse of helping David with business to contact Megan directly. He claimed to know someone who could get wholesale cosmetics, or he could advise her on opening her salon, or show her how to secure a loan. On the surface, it all seemed plausible, since Megan had talked about wanting to open a small spa. But the strange thing was, every time he had something to discuss, he would message Megan directly instead of calling David. And Megan never tried to deflect him. Instead, she seemed to place all her trust in him. I once asked Sarah very gently, "Do you know Kevin is helping Megan with her salon plans?" Sarah was peeling an apple for Lily and just smiled. "Of course. It's good that he's helping your husband's family. We're all family, after all. It's good to help where you can." Seeing her innocent expression, I couldn't bring myself to say more. I was afraid of making her anxious over a few small details. There were times I scolded myself for being suspicious. Kevin was so good at maintaining his image. In front of Sarah, he was always gentle, calling her the mother of my child, in a half-joking, half-sincere tone. In front of Mark, he always acted honorably. With my parents, he was never disrespectful. Who would believe such a man could be so rotten inside without seeing it for themselves? But intuition is a hard thing to explain. The more I saw Kevin and Megan in the same place, the more I felt a knot in my chest. They never did anything overt, but their eyes would meet and then break away a little too quickly. Their small talk always seemed to have a layer of innuendo just beneath the surface. It made my skin crawl, but I had no concrete proof to bring to Sarah or Mark. Looking back, I understand now. Some affairs don't start with a hug or a handhold. They start with kind advice, with timely help, with half-joking, half-serious compliments. Kevin had wormed his way into everyone's trust like that slowly, cleanly, respectably, until no one realized he was pulling Megan out of her marriage to David, one little piece at a time. The night at the hospital was just the final curtain being torn down. The filth had been festering in the dark for a long, long time. The signs didn't appear all at once, they seeped into our lives bit by bit, like a small crack in a wall. At first, you barely notice it, but over time it spreads until the entire structure is compromised. About 2 months before that night at the hospital, Megan began to change noticeably. She started dressing more meticulously, her hair always perfectly styled, her nails a different color every week. She always wore a cloyingly sweet perfume. Wanting to look nice is one thing every woman does. But the strange part was the hours she kept. She would leave at 7 p.m. for a microblading class, or at 9 p.m. for an advanced skincare workshop. Sometimes she'd say a friend had invited her to look at commercial real estate for her spa. When David asked, Megan would snap, "If you can't help me, don't hold me back. I'm doing this to make money for our family, not to go out and party. Stop interrogating me." David was a gentle soul. Hearing his wife say that, he'd drop it. But one time, he called Mark, his voice heavy with sadness. "Bro, Megan's been out all the time lately. She doesn't pick up my calls, and when she texts back, she just says she's in class. If I ask too many questions, she says I'm being controlling." Mark could only advise his brother to talk to his wife gently, not to escalate things. At the time, we still thought maybe Megan was genuinely trying to learn a trade, to be independent. Around the same time, my sister Sarah started complaining to me about Kevin. She said he'd been unusually busy. He was out for client dinners, almost every night, sometimes not getting home until 11 p.m. His clothes smelled of alcohol, and his phone was always placed face down on the table. Sarah, ever trusting, just sighed, his work must be really stressful. When she asked him about it, he'd just say, "It's tough being a man, Sarah. Don't make it harder for me." Hearing these two stories side by side, a sense of unease began to grow inside me. Megan was out more often. Kevin was out more often. And their absences often coincided in a way that felt too neat to be a coincidence. But I didn't dare say anything to Sarah. A single unsubstantiated suspicion could throw both families into chaos. I couldn't tell David either, for fear of hurting him if I was wrong. Then one afternoon, I took Lily to the supermarket for milk. It was an overcast day, and she was begging for ice cream, so I took a small side street behind the shopping center. As I was about to call a ride, I saw a familiar figure step out of the side door of a small motel on the corner. It was Megan. She was wearing sunglasses, her hair pulled back in a low ponytail, clutching the collar of her jacket as if to hide her face. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. Lily hugged my neck. "Mommy, why did we stop?" Before I could answer, a few minutes later, Kevin emerged from the same door. His shirt was slightly untucked, the cuff of one sleeve unbuttoned. He held his phone up to obscure half his face, glanced around nervously, and then hurried toward a car parked across the street. In that moment, my feet felt nailed to the sidewalk. I wanted to scream their names, to run over and demand to know what they were doing in there. But Lily was in my arms, and she was starting to get fussy. I couldn't just dash across a busy street with her. All I could do was shrink behind a large advertising sign and watch as Megan and Kevin left separately, like two strangers who had never met. That evening, I sent Megan a casual text. "Hey Megan, where are you? Had a quick question for you." Less than a minute later, she replied. "At the spa, sis. What's up?" The reply was too fast, too smooth, as if she had it prepared. I stared at the screen, my hands turning cold. If she was at a spa, why did I see her leaving a motel? If nothing was going on, why was Kevin there, too? I told Mark everything. He sat in silence for a long time, his expression grim. Finally, he said slowly, "We don't have solid proof, Lauren. Don't say anything to Sarah or David yet. If we're not sure and this blows up, it will destroy both families." I understood, but from that day on, I couldn't find any peace. I started paying closer attention, not to catch them, but to answer the growing doubts in my own mind. One day, Megan said she was going to a class, but she didn't post a single photo on social media, which was unusual for her. Another day, Kevin told Sarah he was meeting a client, but the shirt he wore home had the faint scent of the same perfume Megan always wore. These small details began to connect, forming a thread that felt more sinister the more I pulled at it. Still, I never imagined the truth would be exposed in such a humiliating way. The night Lily's fever spiked, my husband and I were at the hospital out of necessity, just another family with a sick child. But that necessity brought us to the right place at the right time to see Kevin and Megan wheeled in from an ambulance, their affair undeniable. What chilled me even more was that as a nurse pulled the blanket over Megan, I caught a glimpse of a silver men's bracelet on her wrist. I recognized it instantly. Just a few days earlier, Sarah had happily shown it to me. She had just bought it for Kevin as an anniversary gift. She'd said he liked simple things, and she'd spent a long time picking out the perfect one. Yet that night, it was on Megan's wrist. I looked at the bracelet, then at Kevin lying helpless behind the curtain, and a wave of cold washed over me. An affair was sordid enough. But to take your wife's anniversary gift and give it to your mistress, that wasn't a moment of weakness. That was a desecration. And as I saw Megan cry, clutching her wrist as if to hide the bracelet from view, I knew there was a secret behind this story that was even more depraved. Lily's fever had, by sheer chance, unlocked a door they had tried so hard to keep sealed. About 40 minutes later, a doctor pulled back the emergency room curtain. His expression was colder than the fluorescent lights overhead. He was probably used to difficult cases, but the gathering crowd of family members whispering, crying, and clamoring with questions would have tried anyone's patience. He pulled off his gloves, surveyed the scene, and said curtly, "The patients are stable for now, but I need the family to maintain order. This is a hospital, not a circus." Just as he finished, we heard the frantic sound of running footsteps down the hall. It was David. He was Mark's younger brother, Megan's husband. He was still in his pajama pants and a t-shirt, wearing mismatched sandals, his hair a mess, his face ashen like someone who'd just been ripped from a nightmare. Mark moved to intercept him, but David had already seen Megan lying on a bed with an IV in her arm. David froze. His eyes darted from Megan to the adjacent bed, where Kevin was sitting with his head in his hands, one arm clutching his chest, his face pale after the medical crisis. In a few short seconds, I saw the world shatter in David's eyes. His voice trembled. "Megan? Kevin? What is going on?" Megan burst into tears. She scrambled off the bed, stumbling toward David and grabbing his legs. "David, please, let me explain. I'm begging you." But David shoved her away as if he'd been burned. Megan collapsed onto the floor, her hair falling over her face, her sobs both pathetic and piercing. David pointed a shaking finger at Kevin, his voice cracking. "One of you is my sister-in-law's husband. The other is my wife. You were brought in on the same gurney in that state, and you want me to listen to an explanation? Do you both think I'm a complete idiot?" His words echoed through the quiet corridor, causing other people in the waiting area to turn and stare. Some gaped openly, others quickly looked down at their phones, though it was clear they were listening intently. I saw Mark clench his jaw. He stepped forward and put a hand on David's shoulder, afraid his brother would lose control and lunge at Kevin. I held Lily, whose fever had broken slightly, and pressed myself against the wall. The noise had woken her, and she buried her face in my neck, whimpering. I patted her back, my eyes still fixed on the unfolding drama. Just then, my sister Sarah arrived. She was my older sister, Kevin's legal wife. She had rushed over so quickly her jacket was on inside out, her hair hastily tied back, her face etched with worry. As soon as she saw Kevin, she ran to his side. Kevin, what happened? Was it an accident? The hospital called and said you were in the ER. She hadn't even noticed Megan yet. A young nurse standing nearby muttered to a colleague. Not an accident. More like he got caught. The comment was quiet, but in the tense silence of the hallway, it was horrifyingly clear. Sarah stopped. She turned to look at the nurse, then slowly, her eyes moved to Megan, who was still crumpled on the floor, her clothes disheveled, her face a mess of tears and makeup. I saw Sarah's eyes slowly turn red. She didn't ask me or Mark. She looked straight at Kevin. And Kevin, the man who was usually so articulate, was silent. He kept his head down, his hands clasped together, not daring to look at his wife. Sarah walked up to him, and before anyone could react, the sharp crack of a slap echoed through the corridor, silencing everyone. Kevin's head snapped to the side, a trickle of blood at the corner of his lip, but he didn't react. Sarah's voice trembled. I'm going to ask you one last time. What is that woman to you? Megan suddenly looked up, perhaps out of fear, shame, or the realization that there was no hiding it anymore. She shrieked. It wasn't just my fault. Don't look at me like I'm the only one who stole your husband. Her words were like gasoline on a fire. Sarah staggered back. I quickly handed Lily to Mark and rushed to support my sister. She gripped my arm so tightly it hurt, her eyes still locked on Kevin as if he were a stranger. Did you hear that? She whispered, her voice devoid of warmth. She said it wasn't just her fault. So you were a willing participant, weren't you? Kevin's lips moved. Sarah, He trailed off, saying nothing more. His silence was crueler than any confession. From the end of the hall, our mother-in-law, Sharon, came running, out of breath. The moment she saw Megan on the floor, she didn't ask David how he was, didn't even glance at Mark, but went straight to Megan and pulled her up. Whatever it is, we'll talk about it at home. Are you trying to make a scene for the whole world to see? She shot a look around the waiting room, her face red with embarrassment. Her reaction chilled me to the bone. Even now, all she cared about was saving face. Her son had been betrayed, her daughter-in-law had committed a shameful act, and two families were falling apart right in front of her. And the first thing she thought of was gossip. David looked at his mother and let out a dry, humorless laugh. You're still defending her, Mom? Sharon glared. Who am I defending? I'm trying to preserve this family's dignity. David shot back. Our family's dignity is lying in that ER bed right over there, Mom. What's left to preserve? His words left Sharon speechless, but only for a second. She turned to me and Sarah, her voice lower but still demanding. This is a private family matter. The fewer outsiders who know, the better. Lauren, take your sister home. Mark, get David out of here before he does something crazy. Sarah looked up, her voice icy. Whose private family matter, Sharon? My family's or yours? My husband is in there with your daughter-in-law. And you're telling me to go home and keep quiet? Sharon's face went pale. Her lips moved, but no words came out. David, unable to take it anymore, lunged toward Kevin. Mark immediately wrapped his arms around his brother. David struggled, yelling, "Let me go. I just want to ask him. Was he so desperate for a woman he had to go after my wife?" Kevin scrambled backward in fear, nearly knocking over the IV stand. The sound of Megan's crying, David's shouting, Sarah's choked breaths, and the whispers of onlookers all merged into a chaotic mess. Someone even raised their phone to record it. I saw it and snapped, "Put your phone away. People's suffering is not your entertainment." The person flinched and lowered their phone, but I knew it was too late to contain this. The doctor on duty came out again, his voice sharp this time. "I'll say this one last time. If you want to fight, do it outside the emergency room. We have other patients to attend to. The children, the elderly, the sick people here are not obligated to listen to your family drama." His words snapped me back to reality. I looked at Lily, who was clinging to Mark's neck, her eyes wide with fear. I walked over and took her back into my arms. In the middle of this hurricane, my daughter was the one thing I had to protect. But as I looked at Sarah standing frozen, David shaking with rage, and Mark, his face gray with pain and shame, I knew things were far beyond saving. That night, the ambulance hadn't just brought two patients to the hospital. It had delivered a dirty secret that crashed straight into two families, leaving no one with the ability to pretend everything was okay anymore. I thought that after the doctor's outburst, things might quiet down. At least long enough for the patients to be monitored. But less than 10 minutes later, a female nurse emerged and called for Megan's family to step into a consultation room. She held a file, her expression serious. "The doctor needs to discuss patient Megan's condition further." We need her next of kin to sign consent for some additional tests. David stood up instinctively, but his legs were unsteady, and Mark had to support him. I held Lily, and stood beside Sarah, while Sharon immediately pushed to the front. I'm her mother-in-law. You can talk to me. David turned to his mother, his voice hoarse. I'm her husband. The words made Sharon stop. Perhaps only then did she remember that the person in the most pain wasn't her or her family's reputation, but David. My gentle brother-in-law walked into the consultation room, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. Sarah followed, as Kevin's wife. Mark and I stood just behind them, ready to intervene if things escalated. Kevin was seated in a corner, wearing a hospital gown, his head bowed. The articulate, confident man from our family dinners was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a person. Megan sat across from him, her eyes swollen, one hand resting unconsciously on her stomach. At first, I thought she was just shaking from fear, but that gesture struck me as odd. The doctor looked at the file, then up at us, enunciating each word clearly. Who is the legal husband of patient Megan Miller? David stepped forward, his voice trembling. That's me. The doctor nodded, placing a test result on the table. We need to inform you of something. The patient is approximately 8 weeks pregnant. There are certain medications we need to consider carefully during treatment, which is why we must discuss this with the family. The room fell silent. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner overhead. David took half a step back. His face drained of all color. Mark, standing behind him, was also frozen. Sharon's eyes widened, her lips trembling. Pregnant? Sarah whipped her head around to stare at Kevin. Her eyes were bloodshot, her voice strangled. Whose is it? No one answered right away. The silence was its own confession. Megan burst into tears, her hands flying to her stomach, her body curling in on itself as if to escape everyone's gaze. She shook her head frantically. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't want any of this. David let out a laugh, a dry, broken sound that was more painful than a scream. He pointed at Megan, then at Kevin. You didn't mean for it to happen? You're my wife. He's my sister-in-law's husband. You were sneaking around behind both our families' backs, and now you're telling me you didn't mean for it to happen? He slammed his hand on a nearby metal chair. The sharp clang made me jump, and I held Lily tighter. Megan sobbed. David, please, I'm so confused. I don't know what to do. David bit out each word. Confused enough to sleep with another man? Confused enough to get pregnant and let me think it was mine? As the last words left his mouth, he looked like he might collapse. Mark had to grab his shoulders to steady him. Sarah, however, stared at Kevin without blinking. She didn't scream or cry hysterically as I might have. She just asked again, her voice so cold it gave me goosebumps. Kevin, I'm asking you. Whose baby is it? Kevin looked up slowly, his gaze avoiding Sarah's before landing on Megan's pale face. He mumbled, his voice barely a whisper, it's mine. The room exploded. Sarah lunged forward and grabbed the collar of Kevin's gown. You are having another man's child behind my back? You let me stay at home, trusting you, taking care of our son, our parents, while you were out becoming the father to another woman's baby? Kevin didn't resist. He just stammered, Sarah, I was wrong. I got caught up in it. She let out a sharp, tear-filled laugh. Caught up in it? Did someone force you into her bed? Or did you walk in yourself and now you want to play the victim? It was then that Sharon seemed to snap out of her shock. She rushed over and slapped Megan hard across the face. You shameless harlot. I trusted you, I cared for you, and this is how you humiliate my family. Megan clutched her cheek, but this time, she didn't cower. She slowly raised her head, her lips twisted in a bitter sneer, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and grief. You cared for me? Is that why you spent every day telling me my husband was useless? Is that why you told me marrying David was a waste of my life? Sharon froze. Mark turned to look at his mother, his expression dark. David was also stunned, as if he'd just been stabbed again. Megan continued, her voice growing sharper. If you hadn't kept telling me I needed to find a real provider, if you hadn't said a beautiful woman who doesn't marry a rich man is a fool, do you think I would have ended up like this? The words hung in the air, chilling the room. Sharon stammered, You can't blame me for this. You're the one who's corrupt. Megan laughed, tears still streaming down her face. Oh, I'm corrupt. But don't you act so innocent. You're the one who planted the seed in my head that David wasn't worth relying on. David looked at his mother, his eyes red. He asked softly, Mom, did you really say that? Sharon avoided her son's gaze, trying to sound defiant. I was just angry. I just wanted you to try harder. David shook his head, his smile more like a grimace. You wanted me to try harder by telling my wife to find someone else to lean on? No one spoke. Sarah sank into a chair, her face in her hands. Kevin remained in the corner like a man awaiting sentencing. Megan sobbed, clutching her stomach. And Sharon, the woman who had just been so concerned with her family's dignity, stood rooted to the spot, her face as white as a sheet. I stood there, holding Lily, and felt a coldness deep in my bones. This night hadn't just exposed an affair, it had brought a pregnancy to light, a betrayed family, and a mother-in-law whose toxic words had pushed her daughter-in-law toward a disastrous fantasy. And as Sharon's eyes darted away from everyone, I knew we still hadn't reached the bottom of it. After Megan's accusation, the consultation room felt like it had been vacuumed of all air. No one looked at the baby in her womb with any sympathy anymore. It was a child conceived in a tangled mess of sin and bitterness. David stood frozen, his eyes bloodshot, his lips bitten raw. Mark stared at his mother, his gaze heavy, as if the woman he'd respected his whole life had become a stranger in a matter of minutes. Seeing all eyes on her, Sharon immediately pulled Megan into a corner. She leaned in close, her voice a harsh whisper that I could still hear clearly. Are you crazy? Are you trying to drag me down with you? The question sent a chill through me. If she was innocent, why would she be afraid of being dragged down? Megan looked up at Sharon, the red handprint still visible on her cheek, her hair plastered to her face. But her eyes no longer held any submission. She let out a twisted, bitter laugh. Are you scared now, Mom? Were you scared when you said David couldn't keep a wife? Were you scared when you told me to think about my own future? David heard this and staggered back. Mark quickly steadied his brother, but he was shaking himself. David looked at his mother, his voice trembling. Mom, did you really say those things to Megan? Sharon spun around, her face flushed with anger. She's lost her mind. She's cornered, so she's lashing out. When have I ever said that? Megan shrieked. The sound so piercing, it seemed to tear through the last layer of lies. You also said Kevin has money, connections, and ambition. You said being with a man like him was better than suffering a lifetime with David. You said I was young and beautiful and shouldn't bury my life in that cramped little rental. Hearing her husband's name, Sarah slumped in her chair. I rushed to her side. Her hands were ice cold, her lips trembling silently. She kept looking from Kevin to Megan, over and over, like someone in a trance. No way, it's not possible. I put my arm around her, but no words of comfort came. Some wounds are too deep for platitudes. Kevin sat in his corner, his face ashen. He tried to stand but seemed to lack the strength. His usual air of worldly confidence was gone, replaced by the pathetic look of a coward, afraid of being dragged deeper into the mess. Sarah looked at him, tears streaming down her face, but her voice was dry. You heard them say you had money and connections, and that made you feel powerful, didn't it? You enjoyed it when another man's mother used you as bait for her daughter-in-law, didn't you? Kevin lowered his head. Sarah, it's all my fault, he mumbled. Sarah laughed, a sound that was truly chilling. Now you admit it's your fault? Or is it just because there's no way to deny it anymore? David seemed to be in his own world of pain. He stared at Sharon, his eyes filling with tears. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw him cry not loudly, but silently, his tears a testament to his profound humiliation. He asked his mother in a small voice. So all this time, you really thought I was useless, didn't you? Sharon grew flustered. David, don't listen to her nonsense. I just got angry a few times. I'm your mother. How could I ever try to hurt you? David's smile was twisted. You didn't stab me with a knife, Mom. You just used your words to cut me to pieces. You belittled me in front of my wife. You made her despise me. And now you say you were just angry? Sharon was speechless. All her life, she had used her sharp tongue to silence others. But in the face of her son's question, she had no defense. Watching this, Megan wiped her tears away fiercely. She shakily pulled an old phone from her coat pocket and played a recording. Sharon's voice filled the room, each word hitting us like a physical blow. A woman has to be smart, Megan. Stick with David, and you'll spend your whole life in a rental. What good is it that he's a good man? A good man who can't make money just brings misery to his wife and kids. You have to learn to recognize a man with a future. The room was deathly quiet. Megan fast-forwarded a few seconds. This time, it was her own voice on the recording, small and hesitant. But, Kevin is Sarah's husband, Mom. Then came Sharon's voice again, so cold it made my skin crawl. A woman's success depends on her ability to seize opportunities. If he's interested in you, that's your good fortune. As for his family, that's their problem to deal with. I looked at my mother-in-law in disbelief. This was the woman who went to church on Sundays, who lectured her children on family values. She hadn't physically pushed Megan into Kevin's arms, but she had planted the most toxic ideas in her head. That money could justify betrayal, that a poor husband deserved contempt, that you could trample on someone else's happiness for your own gain. Mark's fists were clenched, the veins standing out on his hands. He looked at Sharon, his voice hoarse. "Mom, did you really say those things?" Sharon took a step back, her face pale, but she still tried to deny it. "It's not what you think. I was just advising her to be smarter. I never told her to do something so shameless." Megan shot back, "You didn't say it directly, but you paved the way. You criticized David in front of me. You praised Kevin in front of me. You told me a woman needs to find her support. You made me believe that betrayal could be a smart choice." Sharon lunged for the phone, but Mark stepped in her way. He said, each word slow and deliberate, "Mom, don't touch the evidence." The word evidence made Sharon freeze. David turned his face away, his shoulders shaking. Sarah clutched her chest, struggling to breathe. It was then that Kevin finally looked up, his voice raspy. "It was all my fault. I was wrong. Don't drag anyone else into this." But his confession was too little, too late. No one wanted to hear him play the repentant sinner. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, Sarah's phone buzzed repeatedly. She shakily looked at the screen, and her face instantly turned a deathly white. Before I could ask what was wrong, she shot to her feet, staring at Kevin with an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. And I knew that this night held yet another layer of truth, one that was about to be ripped into the light. Sarah's phone screen lit up again. It wasn't a call, it was a bank notification. She stared at it for a few seconds, her face going from pale to ashen. I was standing right beside her, so I saw the words on the screen, too. "Your savings account has been closed. A transfer of $85,000 has been completed." Sarah trembled so violently she nearly dropped the phone. That wasn't just any money. I knew exactly what it was. For years, she had scrimped and saved every penny for our mother's heart condition. My mom's health was fragile, and her doctor had warned us to have a substantial sum ready for emergency surgery. Sarah had always told me, "I will never touch this money, Lauren. No matter how tight things get, this is for Mom." And in one night, it was gone. Sarah slowly raised her head and looked at Kevin. The pain in her eyes was no longer just that of a betrayed wife. It was the look of someone who had just discovered she'd been swindled to her very core. She lunged at him, grabbing his collar, her voice breaking. "You took my money? You dared to touch the money for my mother's surgery?" Kevin's face went white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His silence only fueled Sarah's fury. She shook him, tears streaming down her face. "I trusted you. I gave you the password because you said you would manage our family's finances. I thought you were looking out for us. Turns out you were funding your escape with another woman." Her words triggered a memory. I remembered being at my parents' house for dinner once when Kevin had said to Sarah with a smile, "Just let me handle the main accounts, honey. Women have too many little things to worry about, it's easy to lose track." At the time, Sarah had looked at him with such trust, saying she felt more secure with him managing their money. It turned out that trust had become the key to the vault. David, standing nearby, heard the mention of money and flinched as if remembering something. He quickly pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. After a few taps, his face turned just as pale. He stammered, "The joint account, our account. It's missing almost $50,000. The room fell into another dead silence. That was the money David had been saving for years, the down payment for a small condo, so he and Megan could finally have a place of their own. I knew he had proudly told Mark that in another year, they'd have enough. Then, he could invite Sharon over without her complaining about their cramped rental. And now, that money was gone, too. Megan buried her face in her hands, sobbing, but this time, no one felt any pity for her. She stammered. "Kevin said. He said he would take me to a new city to have the baby. He promised he would open a spa for me, that he would take care of us." Hearing this, David's eyes turned red with rage. He looked at his wife as if he couldn't believe this was the woman who had shared his bed. "You took my money to go have another man's baby? You used our down payment to open a spa with him?" Megan could only cry. Kevin kept his head down, his shoulders shaking slightly. I couldn't tell if he was trembling from fear, shame, or the exposure of his sordid plan. Mark couldn't hold back any longer. He stepped forward and punched Kevin square in the face. Kevin fell backward, his head hitting the edge of a chair, blood spurting from his lip. People in the room gasped. I quickly pulled Lily back as a doctor rushed in from the hallway, shouting, "Are you trying to commit assault in my hospital?" Mark was restrained by David and a nurse, but he pointed a shaking finger at Kevin, his voice a low growl. "You slept with my brother's wife. You swindled my sister-in-law, and you were planning to steal from both families. Are you even human?" Kevin clutched his face, panting. He knew he could no longer play the victim. He looked up, his eyes wild with panic, and his voice cracked. "I'm in debt. I have gambling debts. I needed the money. If I didn't get it, they were going to kill me." The confession stunned everyone into silence. Sarah looked as if she couldn't believe her ears. "Gambling? You told me you were meeting clients. Entertaining business partners. You were gambling?" Kevin didn't dare look at her, just gave a slight, defeated nod. He explained, between ragged breaths, that he'd gotten deep into a sports betting addiction. It started with small amounts, then grew to thousands, then tens of thousands, until he was taking out loans from loan sharks to chase his losses. The more he lost, the more he borrowed. By the time he realized he was in too deep, there was no way out. I looked at Kevin with utter disgust. The successful, chivalrous, experienced man he pretended to be was just a facade. Underneath was a degenerate gambler, buried in debt, willing to drain his wife dry, manipulate his mistress, and drag two families down with him. It was then that Megan seemed to understand. She shook her head in disbelief. "No, that's not true. You said you needed the money to prepare for me and the baby. You said it was just a temporary loan, that you'd pay it all back." Kevin let out a dry, twisted laugh. "And you believed that? Without that money, I'd be dead. What good would I be to anyone then?" Megan looked as if she'd been slapped again. She clutched her stomach, her body racked with tremors. But David no longer looked at her with pain, only with the cold eyes of someone who had been stripped of every last ounce of compassion. In her panic, Megan revealed more. Kevin had convinced her to get the deed to her in-laws' house to use as collateral. He'd promised it was just temporary, that he would get it back as soon as he sold a piece of land he owned. Hearing this, Sharon, who had been leaning against the wall, swayed on her feet. Mark instinctively reached out to steady his mother, but there was no warmth in his eyes. Sarah collapsed into a chair, laughing and crying at the same time. "I thought the worst was that you were having an affair. I thought maybe you just didn't love me anymore. I never imagined you were planning to bleed my entire family dry, to steal my mother's life-saving surgery money." Kevin said nothing. Some sins only get uglier with explanation. Suddenly, he looked up, straight at me. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with a mix of desperation and resentment. He said something that sent a chill down my spine. "If your kid hadn't gotten sick tonight, Megan and I would have been gone by morning." I clutched Lily tight. She was still sleeping. Her small face pressed against my shoulder. I looked at my daughter, then at Kevin and Megan, at my sister, broken in her chair, and at David, a ghost of his former self. A wave of horror washed over me. My daughter's fever hadn't just brought us to the hospital, it had stopped an escape. If we had been just a few hours later, Kevin and Megan would have vanished with all the money. Sarah would have lost her mother's medical fund. David would have lost his down payment. Both families would have lost their honor, their trust, and their peace, without ever knowing why. And the most terrifying part was that even then, I had the feeling there was another hand, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings. After Kevin's chilling confession, no one in the room had the strength to speak. Sarah sat silently in her chair, clutching her phone as if it were the last tangible thing she owned. David stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor, his face a mask of shock. Megan was curled up in a corner, one hand on her stomach, crying without a sound. And Mark stood beside me, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he fought to control his rage in front of our daughter. Just then, Kevin grimaced, clutching his stomach. I need to use the restroom," he rasped. The doctor gave him a weary look and called a nurse to escort him. Sarah looked up, her eyes cold and empty. "What are you trying to pull now?" Kevin didn't answer, just shuffled out of the room, leaning on the nurse. I watched him go, a strange sense of unease creeping over me. A man who had just been exposed as an adulterer, a thief, and a gambling addict, asking to be excused at the height of the chaos. It didn't feel right. About 15 minutes later, the nurse returned alone, a look of panic on her face. "Where is patient Kevin's family?" "He's not in the restroom." The room erupted. Sarah shot to her feet, her lips trembling. "He escaped." Mark swore under his breath and pulled David with him as they rushed into the hallway to search. I held Lily and backed against the wall, my heart like ice. That man wasn't just a traitor, he was a coward, leaving his wife, his mistress, and 2 families to clean up the catastrophic mess he'd made. Before they could find him, a commotion erupted in the ER lobby. Several rough-looking men strode in, one with tattoos covering his arms, another with a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. One of them held up a photo of Kevin on his phone and showed it to a security guard. "This guy. He came in here, right? Where is he?" His voice wasn't loud, but it was menacing enough to silence the entire hallway. I understood immediately. The loan sharks had tracked him to the hospital. When Sarah saw them, she burst into tears of fear. She stumbled backward, grabbing my arm for support. "Lauren, I didn't know. I swear, I had no idea he was involved with people like this." I didn't know what to say. I handed Lily to Mark and held my sister. Sarah, the woman who once trusted her husband with her bank passwords, was now trembling like a lost child. One of the loan sharks spotted Megan. He narrowed his eyes and pointed at her. You're with Kevin, right? Where's the money?" Megan shrank back, clutching her stomach, her face drained of all color. "I don't know, I don't have his money." The man sneered. "You don't know? He told us he was taking off with you and the cash this morning. Now he's gone. You expect us to believe you don't know?" David, who was standing by the door, immediately moved to stand in front of Megan. I was stunned. This woman had just betrayed him in the most painful way possible, and she was pregnant with another man's child. Yet, his first instinct was still to protect her. He ground out, "This is a hospital. If you have a problem, take it to the police." Another man scoffed. "You the cuckolded husband? Get out of the way. This has nothing to do with you." David clenched his fists, but before he could reply, Mark stepped up to stand beside his brother. He spoke clearly, each word heavy. "There are cameras here, there's security, and there are doctors. You touch anyone in this hospital, and I'm calling the cops immediately." The air was so thick with tension it felt like it could ignite. The shouting startled Lily awake, and she started crying in my arms. "Mommy. I'm scared." I held her close, covering her ears. In the brightly lit hospital corridor, I felt a deep, profound chill. Just a few hours ago, we were a normal family with a sick kid. Now, we were surrounded by adultery, pregnancy, theft, and loan sharks, with 2 families in ruins. At the peak of the chaos, someone at the end of the hall shouted. Kevin appeared, his face bloody, his hospital gown torn, limping heavily. He must have tried to escape through a back exit and been caught. The moment he saw Sarah, he stumbled toward her and collapsed to his knees right there in the middle of the hallway. "Sarah, I was wrong. Please, help me this one time. For the sake of all our years together." Sarah looked down at the man kneeling before her, her expression terrifyingly blank. She didn't help him up. She didn't scream at him. She just asked, her voice barely a whisper. "When you were stealing my mother's money, did you remember all our years together?" Kevin was speechless. A moment later, one of the loan sharks walked up and kicked him hard in the shoulder, sending him sprawling. Hospital security rushed over to intervene. The doctor on duty yelled for everyone to get out of the ER, but the men wouldn't let go. One of them grabbed Kevin by the collar. "Where's our money? You said you'd have it this morning. You think you can hide in a hospital and play dead?" Kevin shielded his face, begging. "Just give me one more day. I can get it." The man laughed coldly. "From your wife's account or your girlfriend's?" The words were another knife in the hearts of Sarah and David. Sarah sank onto a bench, watching her husband get dragged around without a flicker of emotion. It wasn't pain on her face anymore, it was the complete, bottomless despair of someone who had nothing left to feel. Megan was crying, clutching her stomach. For the first time, I saw raw, unfiltered fear in her eyes, not calculation. Perhaps only then did she realize that Kevin hadn't chosen her out of love. He had used her as a pawn in his desperate escape plan. She looked at David, her lips trembling. "David." But David cut her off. He turned, his eyes bloodshot, but his voice was eerily calm. "From now on, whatever happens to you, don't call my name." With that one sentence, Megan seemed to break. She collapsed to the floor, her hand still on her stomach, her mouth moving but no sound coming out. Security finally managed to push the loan sharks out into the hospital courtyard. Kevin was dragged away with them, his protests lost in a stream of curses. The local police were called. Sarah remained on the floor, staring after her husband as if he were a stranger she had never met. David leaned against a wall, shaking, but he wasn't crying anymore. Mark went to his brother's side. I held Lily, listening as another ambulance siren started up in the distance. I thought we had finally hit rock bottom. But then I looked over and saw Sharon standing silently in a corner of the hallway. Her face was white, her hands clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were bone. Her eyes weren't on Kevin, David, or Megan. They were fixed on the emergency exit stairwell, a flicker of panic in them that she hid too slowly. In that instant, I knew the night wasn't over. Kevin and Megan had been exposed. But there was one more person, the one who had stood in the shadows, whispering encouragement, offering toxic silence, who had not yet paid the price. That person was Sharon. The local police arrived at the hospital just before dawn. 2 officers walked into the ER, followed by a hospital security guard and the doctor who had been on duty all night. The loan sharks were still in the courtyard, shouting obscenities. Kevin was being held near the entrance, his face a bloody mess, his hospital gown in tatters. He looked so pathetic that if you hadn't seen the whole story unfold, you'd never believe this was the same man who preached morality at family dinners. The officers asked a few preliminary questions and then told Kevin he had to come down to the station. There had been a report of him evading a debt and causing a public disturbance. Kevin looked at Sarah in a panic, a last, desperate plea in his eyes. "Sarah, say something. Just one word. I'm still your husband." Sarah stood a few feet away from him, her eyes swollen but her gaze now cold. She replied softly, "The moment you stole my mother's surgery money, you lost the right to call yourself my husband." As Kevin was led away, no one followed, no one tried to stop them. Sarah watched his silhouette disappear behind the glass doors, and then her whole body went limp. If I hadn't caught her, she would have collapsed. She wasn't sobbing anymore, just taking shallow, difficult breaths, as if a great weight was crushing her chest. I held her, my heart aching with a mix of pity and anger. A marriage of so many years, ending with the cold, distant gaze of strangers in a hospital hallway. But while everyone was focused on Kevin, I was watching Sharon. She didn't follow to see where they were taking Kevin, nor did she check on David. She stood in the corner, her eyes darting around nervously, one hand gripping the strap of her purse. When she saw Mark talking to the police, David sitting in a daze, and Sarah being comforted by me, she immediately grabbed Megan and pulled her toward the emergency stairwell. Megan was still weak and unsteady, but Sharon practically dragged her. Something about that gesture felt wrong. I gave Lily to Mark. "Honey, watch her for a minute." He was exhausted and just nodded. I quietly followed them, hiding behind the partially open stairwell door. Sharon's voice was low but tight with menace. "You keep your mouth shut, and you might have a chance. You say one more word, and you'll regret it." The threat sent a shiver down my spine. Megan started to cry, her voice a mixture of fear and resentment. "Isn't what I've been through enough for you? I've lost my husband, my reputation, and maybe even this baby. And you still want me to be silent?" Sharon hissed. "You were stupid, and you got caught. I told you to be smart, not to get caught in the act." Megan let out a dry, broken laugh. "You make it sound so simple. When Kevin promised he'd take care of the money, you were the one who told me to grab the opportunity. When he said he needed the documents to secure a loan, you said it would all be over by morning. Now that everything has blown up, you're just going to wash your hands of it?" Standing outside, my heart was hammering against my ribs. What documents? What loan? This was no longer just about an affair or a pregnancy. Sharon was hiding a much bigger piece of Kevin and Megan's plan, a piece that even Mark and David didn't know about. I was about to go get Mark when David's phone rang, the sound shattering the tense atmosphere. He answered, and his expression changed instantly. He shot to his feet, his voice trembling. "What? The safe is open? Dad, tell me again, what's missing?" Sharon emerged from the stairwell just then, her face pale, but she tried to act nonchalant. David hung up the phone and spun around to face his mother. "Mom, Dad just called. The safe at home was opened. The house deed, the savings bonds, the land sale contracts. They're all gone." The hallway fell silent. Mark walked over, his voice hoarse. "What do you mean, all gone?" David looked at his older brother, his eyes red. "Dad said you had the key last night, Mom. He woke up this morning and the safe was wide open." Mark turned to his mother, his face frighteningly cold. "Mom. Explain." Sharon immediately went on the defensive, her usual tactic when cornered. "Why are you all looking at me like I'm a thief? I'm not even dead yet, and you're interrogating me like a criminal." David's voice shook. "Did you give the documents to Kevin?" Sharon slapped him hard across the face. "Have you lost your mind because you lost your wife? I'm your mother." The slap stunned David, but this time, he didn't back down. He slowly turned to look at his mother with an expression I had never seen before, one of deep pain, but also of dawning clarity. "Yes. You are my mother. And because you are my mother, I'm asking you one last time. Where are the house documents? Before Sharon could answer, Megan's phone rang, the ringtone shrill and jarring. Megan glanced at the screen, her face turning white, and tried to silence it, but Mark stepped forward and grabbed her hand. Answer it. Megan shook her head, her lips trembling. Mark's voice was firm. I said, answer the phone. Megan put it on speaker. A woman's voice spoke quickly on the other end. Megan? This is Amy from the notary's office. Kevin said you'd be in this morning to sign the papers to transfer the house title. If you're not here on time, the buyers are going to pull their offer. Do you have the original documents with you? No one breathed. Megan quickly ended the call, but it was too late. Mark snatched the phone from her. Megan tried to get it back, but David held her wrist, his voice strained. Let my brother see it. If you have any shame left, stop hiding things. The phone screen showed a long thread of messages between Megan and Kevin. They had been planning to sell the house, the one in my in-laws' names, to pay off Kevin's debts and then disappear. Kevin had promised Megan that once the house was sold, he would take her away, they'd have the baby, and he'd set her up with a small spa. Megan had asked what would happen if David found out. Kevin had replied, by then, it'll be too late for him to do anything. I read it, and my hands and feet went cold. But the biggest shock wasn't in their messages. Mark scrolled up. A text from Sharon was there in plain sight. Just make sure you get the house before this all blows up. Don't let David find out. David stared at the screen for a long time. No one dared to speak. Sharon stood a few feet away, her lips trembling. Her face as white as paper. Mark looked at his mother, his voice quiet but each word like a stone. You knew. You didn't just know, Mom. You helped them. Sharon stumbled back, her back hitting the wall. I was just trying to save this family. Kevin said if he could get the money, he would pay it all back. I thought. Mark cut her off. You thought? You thought you could save this family by giving the house deed to the man sleeping with your daughter-in-law? You thought you could save it by letting my brother lose his wife, his money, and his trust in his own mother? Suddenly, David laughed a dry, hacking sound so full of pain it made my throat ache to hear it. So I wasn't just betrayed by my wife. I was sold out by my own mother. Megan bowed her head, crying silently. And Sharon stood frozen, for the first time in her life, with nothing left to say. I watched the scene unfold, a profound chill settling over me. I finally understood. Sharon wasn't just a toxic, image-obsessed mother-in-law. She had been an active participant in the plan to steal their family's assets, an accomplice to Kevin and Megan. And the most terrifying realization of all was that if Lily hadn't gotten sick, if we hadn't rushed her to the hospital that night, by the next morning, that house would have been sold. The money would have been gone, and we all would have still been sleeping peacefully in a trap set by our own family. I thought that after Sharon's texts were exposed, the night couldn't possibly get any worse. But some nights just get colder as they approach the dawn. While everyone stood frozen, staring at the message. Just make sure you get the house before this all blows up. A doctor from the pediatric wing walked over and called my name. His voice was calm, but in the tense hallway, it made my heart leap into my throat. Lauren, could I speak with you privately for a moment about Lily? I immediately looked at Mark. He was holding our daughter, who was limp against his shoulder, her fever down but still clearly exhausted. I quickly followed the doctor to a quieter end of the hall. He held a chart, his expression no longer as reassuring as it had been earlier. He asked me very carefully. Before she developed the fever last night, did she eat or drink anything unusual? Did she take any medication besides a fever reducer? I froze, my mind racing through every detail of the previous evening. Lily came home from her shots, ate the chicken and rice soup I made, and drank some water. Then she played in the living room for a while. I shook my head. No, she only had the soup I made at home. And then, my voice caught in my throat. I remembered. Just before she went to bed, Sharon had taken her into the other room for a few minutes and had given her a small glass of orange juice. At the time, she had said it so naturally. Grandma will give you some vitamin C to help you feel better after your shots. I hadn't thought twice about it. She was Lily's grandmother. Despite our differences, I never imagined she would do anything to harm her own grandchild. I told the doctor about the orange juice. He frowned. He lowered his voice. I need you to remain calm. Your daughter's symptoms are not typical of a standard post-vaccination reaction. A fever can happen, but the level of lethargy and slowed response time she had upon admission prompted us to run some additional tests. My legs felt weak. What do you mean? The doctor showed me the preliminary lab results, pointing to a few lines of medical jargon I didn't understand. He spoke slowly. We found traces of a mild sedative in her system. It's not a life-threatening dose, but in a small child, it can cause deep sleep, confusion, and disrupt body temperature regulation. I would advise you to check if she might have accidentally ingested any adult medication. The phone in my hand almost slipped from my grasp. My ears were ringing, and the hallway started to spin. Lily hadn't just had a fever. There was a sedative in her system. A 3-year-old doesn't get her own pills. She doesn't mix them into her own orange juice. Seeing me sway, Mark rushed over, still holding Lily. "Lauren, what's wrong?" I turned to my husband, my lips trembling so hard I could barely speak. "The doctor, he said they found traces of a sedative in her system." Mark went still. He looked down at our sleeping daughter, then at the doctor, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Are you saying someone gave our daughter drugs?" The doctor was careful. "If the family suspects a child was given unprescribed medication, you should file a report with the hospital and the police." He was speaking professionally, but his words were like needles in my brain. I remembered Sharon in the room with Lily. I remembered her saying, "You go get things ready for bed, Lauren. I'll get her to sleep." And I remembered something else she'd said right before Lily's fever spiked. She had stood at our bedroom door and remarked, "Looks like it's going to be a long night for everyone." At the time, I thought she was just worried about a normal fever. Now, thinking back, a cold dread washed over me. Why had she said it like she already knew what was coming? Mark didn't wait another second. He handed Lily to me and walked straight toward his mother. Sharon, who was trying to compose herself after the text message debacle, scowled as he approached. "What is it now?" "I'm exhausted." Mark slapped the lab results down on a small table in the hallway. His voice was low and terrifying. "Mom, tell me. What did you give Lily to drink last night?" Sharon flinched, her eyes darting toward me before she raised her voice. "I gave her orange juice." "What's wrong with that?" Mark's fists clenched. There were sedatives in her system. The words hung in the air, freezing everyone. David looked up sharply. Sarah turned around. Even Megan went silent in her corner. Sharon's face paled, but she immediately shot back. "Are you accusing me of poisoning my own granddaughter?" "Mark, you watch what you say. I'm her grandmother." Mark looked at his mother, his eyes red. "It's because you're her grandmother that I'm trying to ask you before I call the police." Sharon's expression was a mixture of fury and panic. "I don't know anything about any sedatives." "Just because a doctor says something, you believe it?" "The child had a fever from her shots." "What does that have to do with me?" Just then, David spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I saw you take Dad's sleeping pills yesterday, Mom." The hallway fell silent. Sharon spun around to face David, her eyes blazing. David stood up, his face still pale, but he was no longer avoiding her gaze. "I asked you what you were doing, and you said Dad was having trouble sleeping, so you were getting them ready for him. But Dad was at Uncle's house for dinner last night. He wasn't even home." Sharon shrieked. "I took out half a pill for him to use the next day." "What are you trying to imply?" But her denial was weak. Mark looked at his mother, his voice shaking more with pain than anger. "Half a pill for an adult. Did you put it near her, Mom? Or did you crush it up and mix it into her juice?" Sharon stumbled backward. She wanted to yell, to dominate the conversation as she always did, but she couldn't find the words. I clutched Lily, a wave of rage rising in my throat. I didn't want to believe it, but all the pieces were fitting together. This was the night Kevin and Megan were supposed to run. If Lily was just sleepy at home, we would have stayed up with her. We wouldn't have left the house. We wouldn't have been at the hospital to see that ambulance. A monstrous thought took shape in my mind. What if Sharon never meant to seriously harm Lily? What if she just wanted to make her groggy and lethargic to keep us at home? What if she thought that if she could just delay us for one night, Kevin and Megan would be gone with the money, the house papers would be signed, and no one would be the wiser until it was too late? I looked at Sharon, my voice trembling. "Tell me, Mom, did you drug my daughter to make her sleep?" Sharon's eyes bulged. "Shut your mouth. How dare you, a daughter-in-law, accuse me of such a thing?" Mark slammed his hand on the table. The loud bang made Lily jump in my arms. He practically roared. "Are you insane, Mom? You used your own granddaughter to cover for them." No one spoke. Sharon stood frozen, her lips moving but no sound coming out, her eyes darting around wildly. There was no outrage in her expression, no sign of a person falsely accused. Her silence was the confession. That night, it wasn't just Kevin and Megan who were corrupt. It wasn't just a plot to steal money and a house. Even my daughter's illness was a calculated move in their sick game. I held my child tighter, tears of fury finally spilling over. Lily was her grandchild, the little girl who called her grandma in a sweet, lispy voice. And for money, for pride, to cover up a sordid scheme, she had gambled with my daughter's health. In that moment, I no longer saw my mother-in-law. I saw a woman who had gone so far down a dark path that she could no longer tell the difference between family and collateral damage. After Mark's accusation, the hospital corridor became so quiet I could hear the steady beeping of a heart monitor from a nearby room. Sharon stood rooted to the spot, her face ashen, her lips moving without a sound. All her life, she had used her sharp voice to control her family, to demand respect as a mother-in-law. But this time, no one was bowing down. The person who finally broke the silence was Megan. She was still on the floor, her hair a tangled mess, her face pale from the night's ordeals. But strangely, she wasn't crying anymore. She slowly wiped her tears and looked up at Sharon, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and despair. "You were just going to let me take the fall for everything, weren't you?" Her voice was hoarse but clear. Sharon flinched. "What nonsense are you spouting now?" Megan laughed, a dry, chilling sound. "Nonsense? From the very beginning, you were the one who pushed me. You told me to latch onto Kevin. You told me David had no future. Now that it's all blown up, you want to pretend you had nothing to do with it?" David stood nearby, completely frozen. Mark turned to look at his younger brother with an expression of profound sorrow. And I held Lily, my heart aching for my daughter, while a cold fear crept up my spine as the truth was peeled back, layer by horrifying layer. Megan shakily reached into her purse and pulled out an old, cracked smartphone. She tapped the screen a few times and put it on speaker. "I knew this day might come, so I saved this. Don't think I was stupid enough to do everything you said without keeping a lifeline for myself." Sharon's voice, clear and undeniable, filled the air from the phone's speaker. "Hold on tight to Kevin. He has money, connections. He's the one who can lift this whole family up. If you stay with David, your whole life will be rentals, grocery budgets, and utility bills." Next came Megan's voice from the recording, hesitant and small. "But Kevin is Sarah's husband. What if she finds out, Mom?" Sharon scoffed. "So what if she finds out? Women like her learn to live with it. As long as there's money, that's all that matters. Sarah is too timid to ever make a scene." Hearing that, Sarah broke down completely, sobbing into her hands, her body bent over as if she'd been struck from behind. I quickly set Lily down on a chair next to Mark and rushed to her side. She grabbed my hand, her nails digging into my skin. "Lauren, I lived with that family for so many years. And in their eyes, I was just the quiet wife who could be walked all over?" I was speechless. Some pain is too deep for words. Sarah had lost her husband, her money, her trust, and now she was hearing her own sister-in-law's mother call her a doormat. I could only hold her tighter to keep her from collapsing. But Megan wasn't finished. She skipped to another part of the recording. This time, Sharon's voice was quieter, but even more venomous. "If you want to keep a man, you need to have his child. If you get pregnant with Kevin's baby, he won't be able to leave you. A man like him needs an heir, someone who will listen to him, not a wife who just clings to her title." Megan's recorded voice was tearful. "But I'm scared, Mom. What if David finds out?" Sharon's reply was chillingly casual. "So what if David finds out? He's soft as clay. He'll yell for a few days, and then get over it. He loves you so much, he'd probably end up raising the baby as his own. At least our family would save face." Hearing this, David finally broke. He didn't scream or curse. He just buried his head in his hands and sat down heavily on a waiting room chair, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "What do you think I am, Mom?" His muffled voice pleaded. "I'm your son. You can hate me for being poor, for not being successful, but how could you plan for me to raise another man's child?" Sharon lunged forward in a panic, trying to snatch the phone from Megan. "Turn it off. Turn that thing off right now." But Mark was faster. He stepped in front of Megan, his voice like ice. "Stay where you are, Mom." Sharon glared at her eldest son. "You're turning against me, too?" Mark looked at his mother, his eyes bloodshot. "It's not me turning against you, Mom. It's you who pushed all of us to the other side." Sharon seemed to lose her mind. She pointed a trembling finger at each of us, her voice cracking. "I did it all for this family. I didn't want you to be poor. I didn't want David to be looked down on. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. What did I do wrong?" David looked up, his face streaked with tears. You call selling out your own son, pushing his wife into another man's arms, and using your granddaughter as a pawn and opportunity? The question hit Sharon like a physical blow. She staggered back, her lips trembling. Megan clutched the old phone, her expression no longer that of a victim but of a cornered animal determined to drag her hunter down with her. Don't say you did it for us. You did it for your own pride. You wanted money to show off to the relatives. You wanted your daughter-in-law to make you look good. You couldn't stand David being poor because it embarrassed you. You thought you'd win with Kevin. But you lost, Mom. You lost everything. Just then, one of the police officers returned from the hospital entrance. He was with a security guard, holding a notepad. Is Kevin Miller's family here? Mr. Miller has made an additional statement. He claims that, besides the transferred funds, another individual was holding on to some documents and cash for him. We need to clarify this. As if on cue, every single person in the hallway turned to look at Sharon. She stood there as if her bones had dissolved. The purse she was clutching slipped from her grasp and fell to the floor. The zipper burst open, revealing several thick envelopes of cash and a stack of documents in a clear plastic sleeve. Mark bent down and picked them up. One glance was all it took for his face to darken. It was a photocopy of the house deed, savings bonds, and several unsigned power of attorney forms. Sharon sank onto a chair, her eyes staring blankly into space. This time, she didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't try to shift the blame. All the evidence was at her feet, right in front of her sons, her daughter-in-law, my family, and the police. I stared at her. Just a few hours ago, she was the one demanding everyone keep quiet to protect the family's reputation. Now, she was the one stripped bare in front of everyone. A horrifying thought occurred to me. Some people don't need a knife to make their family bleed. For pride, for money, for the illusion of success, Sharon had single-handedly pushed her son off a cliff, guided her daughter-in-law into a life of sin, endangered her own grandchild, and destroyed 2 families in a single night. After the police took everyone involved down to the station, I didn't think I had the strength to witness anything more. Lily was admitted to the pediatric ward for observation. Mark stayed with her for a while before joining David to give their statements. Sarah went as well, though she looked completely drained. I watched my sister walk away, my heart aching for her. Just a few hours ago, she was a trusting wife. Now, she had lost everything: her faith, the money for our mother's health, and the home she thought was her sanctuary. At the police station, Kevin finally broke. In front of the investigators, Sarah, David, Mark, and Sharon, he confessed everything. His voice, shaky at first, grew detached, like a man who knew he'd hit rock bottom. He admitted to being nearly $120,000 in debt from sports betting and loan sharks. It started small, but as his losses mounted, he became desperate. He confessed that his initial plan was just to swindle Sarah. She was trusting, and he had access to the savings account for my mother. He was going to drain it and claim a failed business investment. Hearing this, Sarah, sitting across from him, just closed her eyes. The tears were gone, perhaps she had none left. But when Kevin met Megan, his plan grew more depraved. He saw an ambitious woman, unhappy in her marriage and constantly being fed a narrative by Sharon that her husband was a failure. Kevin said coldly, "I just had to show her a little attention, and she opened the door for me." Megan, sitting in a corner of the room, looked up, her face white. "What are you saying? You told me you loved me." Kevin looked at her, his eyes devoid of any feigned affection, filled only with contempt. "Did you really think I was going to leave my wife for you? I was drowning in debt. You had access to your husband's money and your in-law's house deed, and a mother-in-law backing you up. If I wasn't going to use you, who was I going to use?" His words shattered Megan. She clutched her stomach, fresh tears streaming down her face, but there was no one left to comfort her. David, standing just outside the interrogation room, heard every word. I saw his shoulders tremble, but he didn't storm in. Perhaps the pain had finally eclipsed his anger. Kevin continued, explaining how he had cultivated his image to win Megan's trust, promising her a new life. He preyed on her insecurities, reinforcing everything Sharon had told her. It was a perfect storm. A desperate man who needed money and an ambitious woman who wanted to escape her life. They hadn't come together for love, but because they saw in each other a sordid means of escape. Megan sobbed. "You promised you'd claim the baby. You promised you'd give us a real life." Kevin laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "A woman who cheats on her husband like you? You were a fling. What kind of life were you expecting?" The room fell silent. Even the officer taking notes paused for a moment. Megan completely broke down, collapsing in her chair. It was likely only then that she truly understood. The man for whom she had sacrificed her marriage, her honor, and her family's money had never seen her as anything more than an easy pawn. David, outside the door, let out a soft, bitter laugh that hurt more than any cry. I was such an idiot. An idiot for loving someone who didn't deserve it, for trusting someone who never even saw me as her husband. Megan turned to look at him, her face a mask of tears. David. He just shook his head. Don't say my name like that anymore. I can't bear to hear it. Sarah, by contrast, was eerily calm. She produced the police report and a request to freeze their assets. Then she turned to Kevin. I'll be filing for divorce today. You don't have to play the part of my husband for another minute. Kevin just bowed his head. The man who had once exuded control was now a broken failure. But the shocks weren't over. When the police examined the documents from Sharon's purse, they found several forms with forged signatures, forgeries of my father-in-law's and David's names. And the person who had supplied the original documents and signature samples to Kevin was Sharon. Hearing this, Mark's face went white. He turned to his mother, his eyes blazing. Mom, do you have any humanity left? Sharon sat in a nearby chair, looking as though she'd aged 10 years overnight. I thought Kevin would get the money and pay it all back. I thought we could sell the papers temporarily and buy them back later. Mark laughed, but his eyes were filled with tears. Sell them temporarily? Do you hear yourself? That's my parents' house, that's David's future. You handed it all over to the man having an affair with your daughter-in-law, and called it a temporary fix? No one had any sympathy left for her. David turned away. Sarah stared at the floor. Megan kept her head bowed. I stood next to Mark, feeling a mixture of cold horror and pity. Sharon wasn't poor. She just couldn't stand feeling inferior. She couldn't stand her younger son being seen as a failure. She couldn't stand the hollow pride she had built her life around. The police informed us that Kevin was being held on charges of fraud, theft, and forgery. Sharon was also required to give a full statement for her role as an accomplice. At the word accomplice, she looked up, stung, but then her head fell again. All her fight gone. I looked at the clock. The sun was rising. In a single night, we had lived a lifetime. If their plan had succeeded, Sarah would have lost our mother's medical fund, David would have lost his down payment, and my in-laws could have lost their home. And the worst part? None of us would have known who was truly responsible until it was far too late. My mind went back to Lily, sleeping in her hospital bed. If she hadn't gotten sick in the middle of the night, if we hadn't rushed her to the ER, Kevin and Megan would have been gone by sunrise. And we would have been left sleeping, still trusting the very people who were digging a pit beneath our feet. The thought made my blood run cold. Sometimes, a disaster comes not to destroy you, but to pull you out of an even deeper trap. A month after that night, Kevin was officially indicted. The charges on the paper fraud, grand larceny, forgery were cold and clinical. But for us, they represented a mountain of wreckage that we didn't know how to begin clearing. Sarah was called in repeatedly to give statements, sign forms, and provide records. Each time she came back, she was a little thinner, her eyes a little more sunken. Kevin's loan sharks didn't give up easily. Even with the police involved, they harassed her, calling her, texting threats, and one time, even pasting a collections notice on her apartment door. She had always been a quiet person, and the ordeal terrified her. In the end, she had to sell her condo at a loss and move in with my mother for a while. The day she moved, I watched her carry a small box to her car. Inside, I could see a few of her old wedding photos, turned face down. She wasn't crying anymore. She just said quietly, "There's no point in keeping some things." Megan was hospitalized again. The emotional trauma, combined with her fragile health, caused her to lose the pregnancy. When I heard the news, I was silent for a long time. I didn't feel pity, but I didn't feel satisfaction either. That unborn child was an innocent life, caught in the crossfire of adult sins, gone before it ever had a chance. David paid her hospital bill. He didn't say a word to her. He just went to the cashier, signed the papers, and left the receipt on her bedside table. When Megan saw him, she cried until her voice was gone. "David, I'm so sorry. I know I was wrong. I never meant for any of this to happen." David stood by her bed, his face gaunt but calm. He looked at her for a long time and said only one thing. "You made your choice the day you betrayed me." Then he turned and walked away. No more yelling, no more accusations. When someone has been hurt that deeply, perhaps they lose the capacity for noise. A few days later, he filed for divorce. He moved out of their old place and into a small studio apartment near his work. Mark tried to give him money, but he refused. "I need to do this myself, bro," he said. "I need to learn to live my own life, the right way." As for Mark, he barely spoke to his mother. Sharon was ostracized by our extended family. The neighbors whispered. The woman who had spent her life terrified of losing face had been publicly humiliated in the most devastating way possible. Her own silence was her punishment. One day, I took Lily over to my in-laws to pick up some of her toys. Sharon was sitting alone in the backyard, her hair grayer, her back more stooped. When she saw Lily toddling toward her, she started to cry. "Lily," she whispered. "Come to Grandma." But Lily, young as she was, sensed the tension and just clung to my leg, watching her warily. Sharon covered her face, her voice choked with sobs. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Grandma is so sorry." Mark, who had been standing behind me, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, his voice low and cold. "Are you sorry for what you did, Mom? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" Hearing that, Sharon seemed to crumble. For the first time, she didn't argue or try to assert her authority. She just wept a late, broken repentance that couldn't undo any of the damage. I didn't blame Mark for his harshness. Some wounds can't be healed with an apology. Lily was our daughter. She had done nothing to deserve being used as a pawn, and the thought that her health had been gambled with, even for a moment, still made my heart seize up. After everything, I often wonder what would have happened if Lily hadn't gotten sick that night. We would have stayed home. Kevin and Megan would have disappeared. Sarah and David would have been financially ruined, and my in-laws could have lost their home, never knowing the full story. That night terrified me. I was afraid of losing my daughter, of watching my sister break, of seeing my husband and his brother fall apart. But looking back, I realized that some crises, as terrible as they are, can save you from something even worse. Lily's fever was a nightmare, but it was also the catalyst that tore down every mask before it was too late. That morning, as the sun began to rise, I stood outside the hospital, holding my sleeping daughter. Mark stood beside me, his hand holding mine tightly. After the long, dark night, his eyes were red and his voice was raw. "Thank God she got sick," he whispered. I didn't reply, just leaned my head against his shoulder. In the distance, an ambulance siren faded away. One night had been enough to shatter two families. One lost a husband, another a wife. My husband and his brother lost a mother, even though she was still there. But in that same night, the truth came out. Some families seem peaceful only because everyone agrees to be silent. But sometimes, that silence is just masking a rot that's eating away at the foundation. When it finally breaks, the pain is immense. But at least then, the survivors know they have to move forward with their eyes wide open, holding on to what is real, and what is truly worth saving.